So I'll be talking today about some invasive plant management options. Um, the bulk of it will be over herbicides, but I did want to touch on these other options because they are important tools in the land management arsenal as well. So just kind of starting off a little background about myself. I've been doing invasive species management and restoration for over 8 years, and I've worked in a wide range of different ecosystems, from forests, prairies, wetlands, and a little bit in the Mojave Desert as well. I currently manage all the research aspects of the RENS lab that doesn't entail, say, graduate or master's students. Um, and then I kind of do the day-to-day, all the field operations as well, and making sure everything kind of goes smoothly and as well. So, as I mentioned, I'm part of the RENS Weed Science Lab, and our research primarily focuses on three areas, which is our agronomy section is kind of the alfalfa work that we do. We look into some pasture research as well, but the main area that my work focuses on is the natural areas and invasive plants. Um, and we're a statewide community. Well, sorry, we're also have the Wisconsin First Detector Network, a part of our lab as well, which is a community of science supporting people who help document and keep up to date on invasives that are taking hold in the state, and we want to make sure that we get ahead of that before it gets out of hand. So the goal of my talk today, I'm going to start with just kind of a brief background of invasives and why we want to manage for them, and then some common management methods, and then with a lot of herbicide options being kind of the bulk of it. So starting with invasive species, what are they? This definition says it's a non-indigenous species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental health to humans and, environment as well. And so a lot of people here have probably seen something like this, which, if you're familiar with it, this is a buckthorn stand that has completely invaded a forested area. And so this is a invasive species coming in and having an ecological issue and causing problems that way. Another thing that can happen, like I said, is the human health impact, which a good example here is wild parsnip, where you get those burns if you get that sap on your skin. And so there's that element to this as well, trying to make sure that these plants aren't coming in and being detrimental to people as well. So because of these issues and these things, the state has created what's called the NR40 list. And this is taking all those invasives and putting them in a list so people can check to see whether they should possess them or plant them or things like that. And so this list is broken up into two groups: the prohibited species, which they're usually ones that aren't as prevalent, but the state is on high alert for. We don't want them to get out and become a problem. And they also have a pretty high impact for environmental health issues as well. Some examples of this would be the Japanese stiltgrass, kudzu, or sawtooth oak. And these are just some examples of those as well. Another one that people might be familiar with is tree of heaven. And this is some information on that, but this is one that's becoming more and more prevalent due to the spotted lanternfly issue that we're having. The spotted lanternfly, as far as I know, hasn't been documented in the state, but we're still keeping an eye out for it. The next one is regulatory categories. These are things that are already established in the state, but they still have higher environmental impacts. And you can kind of see it in this picture. This lady is standing next to a large infestation of garlic mustard. And so you can see why this can be a problem. Here's another example of a restricted species. This is barberry. And you can see this whole picture is just covered in barberry. This was actually a trial where we were looking at tick research in barberry, there's some research shown there's some association with those two. But we had to wade through this, and you can see how much of a problem that would be if any of you have walked through a barberry before. It's not the most fun. So given these problems and these issues, what management options are there for people dealing with these? And there's quite a few. Manual removal, you can do some forestry mowing or feconning. Fire is an option, biological control, and then finally herbicides, which I'll be going into a lot more later. But another thing that dictates what your option and what you should choose is going to be the site details. What's your ultimate goal of the land? Do you want to start fresh and you're just going to be completely reseeding in what you want and go that route? Or are you trying to keep sensitive species or native species, and so you might need to be a little more selective with your options? What invasive shrubs are present or just plants? And then what desirables are there? What's site-specific conditions? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is there topography? And then finally, just your funding available. Everybody has different resource availability and options that they have. So you really have to choose kind of what fits your options. And I'll go through these first options kind of briefly, and then we'll get into the herbicide options. But the first one is the manual removal. The approach to this is you want to remove the crown by either digging or removing it completely. A positive aspect for this option is it's less detrimental to invasive species, as assuming that you don't disrupt the soil too much from removing those plants, but it does allow you to kind of target those and know that what you're pulling out is kind of what you're killing. The negative aspects, there can be the higher ground disturbance. So if you're pulling out big shrubs, there might be a pretty big root mass under there that you might have to move a lot of soil. It's also very labor intensive for anybody that's used, say, a weed wrench like that's in the picture. Doing that for a few hours, it can be pretty labor intensive. Like I just mentioned, there are some specific tools for this. The weed wrench is a great option to help you get some of those tougher ones. And then another thing is conifers. You don't need to remove the root crown. You just need to cut that individual below the lowest limb. So you actually don't need to remove those from the ground. So that's an option if you're dealing with, say, red cedar. You just need to cut those. You don't need to fully remove the root system. Forestry mowing. The approach with this one is you get to clear large areas, and you're using a machine like this, which you can kind of see it says Fecon. That's the brand for this one. But it's just an attachment a lot of times that aggressively mulches and crushes up trees and woody materials. And this is great because you can get a lot of ground covered and do a lot of area in a relatively short amount of time. So you can clear a few acres so much faster than you would if you were going in by hand. The negative aspects of this is it can be expensive. Most people don't have these tools available, and so they have to contract them out. And when you contract them out, you usually have to pay fairly high for those kind of things. And these can be in pretty high demand for the people that want to use them, so it can be kind of hard to find them as well. They do create a pretty high level of disturbance in those work areas. And also they create a lot of mulch. And so if your end goal is to have that understory or what have you grow back kind of immediately, then you're going to need to remove that mulch. Otherwise you'll get, like in the landscaping, you'll get that mulching, potential mulching approach, and you could snuff out some of the things that you want to grow. So it's a great option for some, but if you have some sensitive things or you're wanting to kind of be safe around some things, it might not be the best option. Biological control for this one is goats. It's a pretty common option that people see out there. The idea is you place the goats in an infested area, and they'll usually eat the leaves, and a lot of times they'll strip the bark. We've had some research where we've seen them almost girdle small shrubs where they're eating that bark on the outside, just kind of continuously, and it finally just kind of kills that shrub off. Some positive aspects with this, they're pretty selective in what they choose to eat. And so they will target more often than not, it seems like, the woody species first. And so you can put them in, have them go after, say, honeysuckle and barberry and things like that. And then when you see that that food source is depleting, you can remove them before they start going towards maybe some of those desirable plants and things like that. Another positive aspect, it's not an herbicide. For people who want to go that route, there's this option as well. Some negative aspects with this, it takes multiple years for this to start showing good results for control on things, at least from what we've seen. And you kind of have to do repeated rounds of this if you want to start seeing that result. Again, this one is typically contracted a lot. Most people don't just have a herd of goats that they can put out on their land. And so you usually have to go somewhere else for it, and that can be pretty expensive. Some of the research we've done, I think when we contracted, it was about $5 a day per head for the goats. And so that really starts adding up when you've got them in there for a long time. Another side of it is the husbandry. How much are you going to have to do? Some contractors do everything for you. Some of them just drop the goats off and then they pick them up and that's it. So it's up to you to work on the fencing and watering and making sure that they're still doing okay if there's a storm, has anything happened. So there's also that side of it as well. Another biocontrol option is insects. A great example, which I have here, is the leafy spurge beetle. And there's a few different species of that. I've done a little bit of this kind of control. It takes a long time, and you kind of need the population to establish before you start seeing any results. And even those results are minimal because those bugs need that to survive. And so if they start losing their food source, they're going to start dying off. And so it's kind of a tough one to do unless you have the ability to get these beetles pretty easily and can kind of restocking. Another thing with the biocontrols is there's still a lot of unknowns with introducing these species into areas that maybe they weren't before to control something. We don't know what's going to happen. And so there's also that risk potential with that as well. Another option is going to be prescribed fire. We're just using fire. With this approach, spring burns are really effective, and they can help for the sensitive species. If you can get out there before things start coming up, you can get that duff layer off and allow that soil to get some good sun and those seedlings to thrive and hopefully your natives to come up. And a lot of natives actually thrive with fire. So it's not something that was just out there. These species adapted and evolved with it. And so there's certain things that a good example is prairie dropseed, where the seed production from prairie dropseed goes way up after a burn compared to a year without a burn. So there's certain things that have just evolved to thrive when fire's a part of it. Another, it's not an herbicide again, so you're not using the chemical route with this one. Negative aspects, you're going to have follow-up work. This isn't, it looks like it does more than it probably ultimately does because of just the sheer intensity. But you're going to have to go back in, you're going to have to get resprouts, make sure you get the things that didn't die. And so there's going to be follow-up work. The other thing is you need resources to do this safely and just effectively. And a lot of people don't have that option. So make sure that you have the resources to be able to conduct this safely before you even attempt this, in my opinion. And one last thing is this works, like with the follow-up, this works best with other management. So coming in after you've burned and spraying the resprouts or doing another part of your management at that point. Another fire option is a propane torch. And with this approach, you want to cut the target individual, kind of like you would as a cut stump option. And then you would use a propane torch, and you burn that stump until you get a bright red cherry color. And the thought being that once you get to that point, that heat is enough to kill off that plant. A positive with this, again, it's a non-chemical option for people. The negative with this, it's a fire hazard potentially. So if you're out for some reason trying to do this in dry weather, you have to keep that in mind. But you also are carrying around propane, so there's that fire hazard as well. Some comments with this, you can actually use it on rainy days as long as you can keep that fire going. You can get enough heat to those stumps with that fire that it can still be effective. But one thing is that our lab hasn't seen that great of results when using this option. There has been studies done elsewhere that has seen really good results, but with things that we've tried, we just haven't seen that great of results. And so I wanted to touch on all these other options because it's important to use a mindset with an integrated pest management where it's best to include more than one management approach for what you want to get done. Not one thing is going to be the end all. You're going to need to do repeated managements year in and year out. And it's going to take time to see these results. You don't want to rush it because potentially rushing could make for other problems down the road that you don't want to deal with. So take your time, make sure that you're getting the most of your work and not potentially causing more problems later for yourself down the road. And so after going through those, we're going to get into herbicides, which is kind of the main point of this talk. This is a great option for people who want to control these invasives. It can be effective where you can get one application can kill a shrub or tree or a lot of other invasives, even herbaceous as well. It integrates really well with other methods. So like I was saying, you can do your forestry mowing and then come in after you've had the resprouts come up and then spray those resprouts. Or after your burn, you can come in and do that. Or spraying first and then removing the dead material after. So it works really well to couple this with other things. It's often the most cost effective, especially for large infestations. When you're looking at overall labor costs for things or contracting out for goats or the forestry mower, those can really drive the price up. And so if you're looking at price as a hindrance, then maybe herbicides is going to be your best option. And there's a lot of different application methods for herbicides. You've got foliar, your cut surface or cut stump, basal bark, and then hack and squirt, which stem injection is kind of another option for that as well. A big thing with herbicides, though, is you need to get training on how to safely apply them, how to safely use them, and how to know the limitations and restrictions and things like that, because it's important as land managers that we know what we're using and being able to put them out safely. Another thing with herbicides is you want to be aware of the unwanted impacts from them. You can have desirable species getting impacted. A great example is oaks in the wooded areas. You can have somebody managing for something in a wooded area and they're spraying the understory, but they don't realize that herbicide is getting taken in by those oak tree roots after they've sprayed. So be mindful of the desirable species and what else is on your landscape there. Can't spray near water without a permit or the proper training as well. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about won't deal with water. This will be purely terrestrial. But that's just something to keep in mind. The rule of thumb is the wet sock rule. but if it's already that wet, you probably shouldn't be trying it anyway. Another thing is you can have what's called the ring of death around, say, your target area, especially woody control, where you might have residual effects after you've sprayed for a year or so after the fact. And this can sometimes produce what is called the ring of death around a plant. So you get a big dead zone around a plant, which doesn't allow other things to grow. Even after you've removed that invasive, you're still not allowing new things to come in, new natives or desirables to come in and take that spot. So moving on to preparation and safety with herbicides. When it comes to safety, for PPE, you need to make sure you have safety glasses or goggles like in the picture, and then latex or neoprene gloves. These two are, you need to have these when using herbicide. You want to minimize the ability to have splashback in your eyes with the glasses, and then just absorption through your skin with the gloves. So make sure you always have those. Proper field clothes. This is highly recommended to have, say, long sleeves or long pants. I know most people probably laugh at that, but I have seen people spraying in shorts and cut off shirts before. And so just wearing your proper field clothes that you would to go do this stuff. Long sleeves, long pants, and then closed-toe shoes as well. Some preparation tips and things to remember. Make sure you mix on a flat surface so you can avoid it tipping over or having not the right mix, not the right amounts, and having your amounts messed up. Always start with a small amount of water or oil in the container that you're mixing into. This allows for, if you're using, say, a backpack sprayer, if you were to put herbicide in straight away, what you're doing is, more often than not, that herbicide is probably going to go straight into your sprayer. And when you go to use it the first time, you lose basically all of your herbicide. So this allows you to have some of that mix, the water or oil in there already, and for that herbicide to kind of mix in there right away. Do that small amount, and then you can put your herbicide in your adjuvants, and then you can top it off to the desired amount after that. And you want to make sure that you agitate that mix after you've got it all in the container. And this is true for the first time as well as, say, like midway through, just kind of periodically mixing it. There's a chance that things might come out of a mixture, and so you might be spraying, say, straight oil or water. And so just kind of always be mindful that you need to keep it mixed. So moving on to what we have for our herbicide options for management. The first one is going to be the cut surface application. And for this approach, you're going to be cutting the desired shrub or tree. This won't work for, say, forbs or herbaceous species. This is going to be only for woody species. And what you're going to want to do is cut that stem preferably as low as possible, but you also want to be able to find them if you need to come back. So as close to the ground as you can to maybe a couple inches. And you want to cut those as flat as you can. The idea being that if you cut it at any sort of angle, you have the ability for that herbicide to run off, and then it not being taken in completely by the plant, and it not having maximum control on that plant. So you want to cut it flat, and then you're going to want to apply a 5 to 25% solution to the cut surface. And it's advised to apply as soon as possible after cutting. You can go a little bit after, but it's recommended to do it kind of right after. Not only does it help with better chances of that herbicide working, but you limit leaving it and then, say, missing that stump later if you come back to do it later. So it just helps you make sure that you're going to be treating what you're cutting. And that 5 to 25% is kind of just a general, since this works for basically all woody options. And so it's going to depend on what herbicide you're using, for what that percentage is going to be. Some positive aspects for cut surface. It can be very targeted. You get to limit the off-target movement because you're spraying just that cut area. And so as long as you don't have a lot of splashback or you're just dumping it on there, you're not going to have a lot of off-target impact from that. And one other thing with this is you only need to treat that growing portion of that individual. And so it's going to be that cambium layer that is on kind of the outside of that stump. And you can kind of see in that lower picture on the bigger individual, you see how the middle doesn't have any herbicide. It's just kind of in a ring around the outside. And so on the bigger ones, you don't need to spray the entire stump. You just need to get that growing layer. Another positive aspect is this is a lot more effective, say on bigger things, bigger diameter things than a basal bark option, which I'll go through next. And so it can give you a better option for that if you've got some larger things. A negative is swamping or moving the cut material if that's your ultimate goal. If you need to remove that slash or the debris, then it can be labor intensive. And depending on what you ultimately need to do with that, you need to build a burn pile that could potentially create fire hazards later in for your work. And so it just kind of creates more work potentially that you're going to have to do. Some other comments with cut surface. Some formulations with this can be mixed with water, like glyphosate, where most others are going to need to be mixed with an oil, which they have basal bark oil or bark oil available, which is kind of the standard and is what most people will use, but some people will use kerosene. It doesn't smell the best. It kind of lingers, which is off-putting to people. And I don't know if there's research for environmental impacts, but I would guess there probably would be. So it's probably advised to use the basal bark. It also usually comes with a dye in it, which you can see in that bottom picture as well, which helps you indicate if you've sprayed something or not, which can be helpful. You want to avoid using cut surface in high amounts of snow. What will end up happening is you'll create an impermeable barrier from that water that the oil can't get to. And so the oil will just sit on top of your individual and it won't get absorbed. And so you're just having the herbicide run off and just be wasted at that point. This option can be effective on really big shrubs, which you can see in the left picture, as well as really small ones, which is kind of hard to see, but that's probably a Sharpie marker size stem. So this works really well on varying degrees of sizes for stuff. One other thing to keep in mind is choosing your herbicide, whether it's selective or non-selective. So non-selective options, things like arsenal or glyphosate, they don't have any restrictions on the things they're going to try and kill. So if you put that on the ground or put that on something, it's probably going to kill it. Or the thought is that it's going to kill it. Where Remedy Ultra is selective for broadleaf weeds. And so it is safe for grass to an extent. In higher doses, I've seen it have some injury, but it's pretty safe for most things. And so as you can see in these two pictures, on the left was sprayed with a 20% solution of Remedy Ultra. And where all those blue flags are, we're seeing some new growth coming in after a bunch of buckthorn had been cut and removed. Where on the right side, we have the arsenal, which is non-selective. After going through and treating, we don't have much regrowth. So that's that non-selectiveness of the arsenal targeting most of the things that are there, where the Remedy Ultra is going to allow you to have some selectability and potentially save some species. One other thing I wanted to touch on is this tool. which I don't know if it was created by NASMA, but they market it. It's called the Buckthorn Blaster, which it's kind of a glorified bingo marker. The idea is you fill them with herbicide, and then you have the top pieces, which is kind of like a foam sponge, and you can use this and just dab it on your cut surface area. And what it does is it allows you to really minimize the overuse of herbicides, and it allows you to really target that area for where you want to apply it. So this is great with, say, volunteer options. If people have a big group, it's not cumbersome. I don't know how big they get, but you really don't use a lot of herbicides, so this really lasts quite a ways. And so for people who maybe don't want to use some of those other herbicide application options, this is one that you could use.
I got a couple of questions for you, Travis.
Yeah.
The basil bark oil, where can folks get that?
Um, Most places that you'd find, um, oh, how do I want to say it? Your herb, most places that sell like your wide range of herbicides. So not necessarily Menards or your farm stores that I'm aware of. Um, but the other places that would sell, say, Milestone or Triclopyr or things like that, they will typically have bark oil for sale. Um, in this day and age, there might be more places that offer it as well. But yeah, that's where I'm usually gonna see it is those places that have say like Nutrien is an option where they sell a lot of different herbicides and stuff like that. Or kind of herbicide wholesalers, I guess is how I should say it. So
Okay, and then I'm glad you showed the buckthorn blaster. I was thinking
yeah,
about other application methods. I've seen people use a paintbrush or like a
yep,
sponge painting brush
yep,
to apply it, and even handheld spray bottles.
yeah,
Is one better than the other seasonally? Like is in winter, it's the spray bottles don't. I've heard those can those can freeze up.
sure. Um, I guess for being better than another, the nice thing about, say, the buckthorn blaster or paintbrush, or another one is, this is jargon probably, but a death stick is kind of what people will refer to it as. It's just a really long stick with a sponge at the end. Um,
So you don't have to
they
bend over. Yeah, that's a great
exactly,
idea.
exactly. But they really do minimize that off-target damage or off-target potential with it, and so that's a really nice thing. But it's a good point that you mentioned winter, because you do have some of those mixes kind of gumming up in the winter if you leave it a little bit too cold. I've even had days where you'll be out and it's so cold that while you're out applying, you start having things happen as you're going. Um, I wish I had a good answer for how to alleviate that in really cold weather, but I don't. We just kind of grabbed another one until we got something to work. And so maybe in the winter, as long as you can um, say the buckthorn blaster warmer, you can have it in a pouch or something. It'll stay. You won't get that gelling or whatever happens in the winter with some of these things. But that is a good point with the winter thing. I wish I had a better answer. I know there's some sprayers that have say higher quality or a little bit better O-rings and some better parts that they just allow them not to have those issues as fastly or get those issues as quickly. And so that might help. But I know in my experience, we all ever really only used the really cheap ones, and we were fine with basically ruining those and then getting a new set. So um, I think it kind of depends on, again, what you have for money, what you want to do for your end goal for those options. Yeah.
Thanks.
So moving on to the basil bark application. For this approach, you're going to be using a 15 to 25% solution. It's a little bit higher. than the cut surface. And what you want to do is you want to spray it in a ring. I'm going to go to this just to show an example. On the left, you can kind of see you want to spray the base of your target completely in a ring. And if you can go up to 12 inches, feel free. But anywhere, say 8 on the very low end, but 12 is probably what would be recommended, especially on bigger things. Once you start getting some bigger ones, you just need more herbicide. But on that note, if you start getting that large, maybe a better option like cut surface or something else would be a more viable option. Another thing is you want to make sure that bark is dry. It's kind of like the snow issues with the cut surface. If you have moisture on that bark, you're going to create that barrier and that herbicide isn't going to get drawn in. And so you're just not going to have that control. A positive aspect with the basal bark, you get that targeted treatment. You get limit the off-target movement because you're only impacting that individual that you're spraying. And then you don't have to cut down the tree or shrub, at least that immediate moment. If you are fine with leaving a standing dead, then it's great. You can leave it and not worry about it. If you need to remove that stuff, then you'll probably have to come back later and cut and remove. Negative aspect, like I had kind of mentioned, it doesn't work the best for large stem trees and shrubs because you do have to use a lot more herbicide to kind of compensate for that. And then again, with this, you always need it to be mixed with oil. You can't do a water solution because you need that oil on that bark because what that oil does is it stays longer than the water and it allows that herbicide to be absorbed through the bark and be taken and drawn in by the plant for it to have its full effects. And so like I said before, this is an example of the basal bark application on the left. And on the right is a trial that I had set up, and it's kind of hard to see, but most of that was treated as a basal bark option, and we were getting really good control on the glossy buckthorn that we had applied it to. Our next application option is what's called the hack and squirt or stem injection. For this approach, you want to make cuts around the individual that you're treating. And what you want to do is you want to make sure you get through that cambium layer. You don't need to go full bore and try and cut this down. You just need to get it through that growing layer.
Hey, Travis,
Yep. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I got some questions regarding basal bark.
Yeah.
One of the size limitation is that I heard that you're not supposed to use it if the bark is rough. Is that coinciding with the size of the tree, or a big smooth bark tree is still not a good idea to use this method?
I probably wouldn't on just large individuals in general, just because the amount of herbicide that you'd have to use, say on even a 6-inch diameter tree to get all the way around it and go up high enough, you might be putting way too much herbicide just in that one spot. So I would say 6 inches or less is probably a good, maybe a little smaller for basal bark. It works really, really well, say for your pencil diameter things or your really small shrubs. Say you don't want to go in with a brush cutter and cut them and then potentially lose those stumps and have to come back and hit them again later. So this allows you to see that individual and spray it and then know that it's been sprayed. The bark thing, I can't actually say, but I could see it being a limiter with the rough bark just because you've got so many nooks and crannies. And some of that bark gets really, really dense. And so having it have to go through all of that, it might just not be the best option for that.
Is there seasonal limitations or temperature limitations for using this method? Same with the cut stump. Is there seasonal limitations or temperature limitations?
Seasonally, no, I wouldn't say limitations. Although early spring, when you start getting that really heavy sap and water movement through the individual, it might not be the best because it's really moving moisture and it might just push that herbicide out. And so maybe avoid basal bark or cut surface at that point. but these options are great in the winter. That's one thing I would say. It's not really a limitation, but it's kind of an advantage for people where you can't go in and do your herbaceous or your forb work in the winter since everything's died back. You can still use these throughout the winter and have good control, even when things aren't actively growing leaves and things like that. So it allows for people to use the winter and still be able to get some management done. Extreme cold, though, I would watch out for. Um, I mean, I wouldn't be out spraying below zero anyway, but maybe like zero. There's probably restrictions and stuff on the labels. And herbicides are going to kind of differ from herbicide to herbicide. So um, just make sure to check your label and that you're within what they would recommend for that. So
And there's a question about the potential toxicity to wildlife. There's wildlife that eat buds and branches, and here you're spraying into a tree and it's tree sucking it up. And is it what's your thoughts on that? Does that standing tree that you sprayed with the Basil Park become a toxic a toxic food source to wildlife, or it doesn't affect it at all?
I can't definitively say. As far as I know, that is most of the herbicides are going to be drawn in and taken into the roots. And so what you'll have is it'll be drawn into the roots and not out to the growing points. Um, but I can't 100% say that there wouldn't be something going to the fruit. But if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably minimal. Um, yeah, that's I can't give a more definitive answer, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right, so back to hack and squirt. We were on the approach, which what you want to do with the hack and squirt is you want to make, like I said, these cuts at 45-degree angle through the cambium layer, and you want to make sure you do it at that angle so you can get a pocket for that herbicide. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be injecting a very small amount, say half to 1 milliliter of a concentrated herbicide. This can be a 50% all the way up to 100% solution. And you're just putting that into that hack mark in the individual. And you want to put in one hack, one hit for say every 2 to 3 inches of diameter, which you could probably get away with a couple extra hacks with doing that. Some positive aspects with this, it's a targeted treatment, and so you're only affecting kind of that where you're spraying that herbicide there. And so you're not going to have the off-target spray damage where you would with some of the other options. And then you don't have to cut down the tree or shrub to treat it. Again, this is kind of your end goal. You want that standing dead, or do you want to remove it? So you'll have to deal with that in the long run. Negative S, I meant to change this. I don't know why I have low labor costs. This is actually a pretty positive for low labor costs because all you're doing is you're just carrying around a small amount of herbicide and your tool to do this, which may be a hatchet. If you're doing stem injection, they have syringe options to do this. But as opposed to say girdling, which is kind of what I would consider this the most comparable to, you're lugging around a chainsaw, potentially a lot of herbicide. And so this just gives people an option to not be over encumbered carrying their equipment to do that stuff. One comment with this is that I would recommend it for things that are at least 3 inches, if not bigger. Because if you swing a hatchet at something smaller than 3 inches, you're probably just going to cut through it. So you might as well use another option for that. The last herbicide option I want to talk about is the foliar application. And this one is super common. All those other three options that I mentioned will work for woodies and herbaceous or forbs, or not forbs, it'll only work for woodies, where foliar application is going to be your option for your herbaceous invasives like garlic mustard or parsnip or things like that. And so for foliar options, the approach is you want to follow the label depending on whatever you're using, follow that label. And you want to add a dilute concentration to your mix, just typically a 1 to 3% concentration. And what you want to do is you want to spray that individual, you want to spray the leaves to the point of runoff. And I wish I had a better picture for this, but what if you could visualize it looking at a leaf, what you'll have happening is at the very tip of the leaf, it'll start cooling up, and you can start to just see that drop forming where it's going to drop off. That's kind of that to the point of runoff. So you want to get good coverage with that herbicide. You want to make sure that you get entirely around the individual. Don't just spray one side. You're going to leave the other side with the ability to keep growing and potentially grow through. Some positive aspects with this, you can limit the off-target movement of the herbicide in the soil because you're using a much more diluted concentration than, say, your other options. It's also super fast and cheap compared to the other options because you're using such a smaller amount of herbicide compared to those other options. A negative aspect to this is you have a far higher potential for off-target drift. So you really need to know where you're spraying, have good droplet size given what the wind is producing. And so knowing that you're within safe spraying options to get your management done. Some comments for foliar application. You can apply this from spring all the way through fall or the active growing season. It scales really well for an area. So you can do this on individuals all the way up to, say, acres. And you can have really good effectiveness at both of those scales. Don't spray over your head. The picture on the left is a great example of that borderline of probably not to do. That's probably a little higher than you would want to go. You want to make sure that you're limiting that herbicide being in the air as much as possible. And then weather should be considered anytime you're going to be doing this. Has it rained? Is it gonna rain? Is it high temperatures? When you're using foliar applications, you have a higher chance of volatility in those higher temperatures, so you need to watch that. And then that wind aspect as well. So make sure you understand your limitations when it comes to the wind and what it gives you. When it comes to foliar applications, it's best to, at least for shrubs, to give some time for things to grow back. On the left, you can see things might be a little hard to see, but those are at about knee high, where on the right is about waist high. You want to kind of wait for things to get about waist high so you can make sure that it's giving all that energy above the ground before you spray to give it the most impact to get the best control. So giving it that year of growth could potentially give you better control down the road. Another comment is when you apply. So in these two examples, we have bush honeysuckle, which were both sprayed with a Vaseline, which is a triclopyr at 3%. And on the left, we had honeysuckle that was sprayed in June. And on the right, it was in August. And you can't even see the one on the right because it worked so well. So timing may be a factor as well. So those later season applications for a lot of those woodies seem to do really well, as opposed to, say, earlier when they're trying to push out and kind of establish for the year. And then finally, I've got a chart here, which just gives some comparisons for people amongst those four options. It gives you kind of whether it's an individual plant treatment or you can do kind of an entire area, some cost options, non-target, and then just some notes with it as well.
Is there any limitations for foliar spraying for time of day? Like, could you do treatment at night? Do the plants? I know some plants shut down in the middle of the
Yeah,
day because it's too warm. What's your best management practices suggestion?
I can't probably say one way or another whether there'd be more or less effectiveness for the herbicide. I guess I would, if I had to guess, maybe less. The only thing I would worry about is visuals. Obviously, you're running into other safety hazards while you're out in the woods at night. Being able to see things, are you spraying things enough, especially foliar at night, to make sure you're covering everything. So you could. I just I don't have any experience with it, and I don't know much of others doing it at night either. So
So, is morning better than later afternoon? Other than windy being more windy in the
yeah,
afternoon, what's your suggestions that way?
again, I'm not sure on the effectiveness, but I would say not right away in the mornings. And the only reason I say that is a lot of times due to that dew, or you have that moisture component right away in the mornings. And so allowing that to dry off a little bit allows you better control because you don't have that water that's lingering, mixing with the herbicide and possibly running off. So I guess the early morning, just avoid the heavy dews and stuff like that. But effectiveness, I can't say um, whether there's an impact to it or not. And so the last little bit that I wanted to go through was just some specific recommendations and things for individual species. But what I wanted to touch on is, again, I'm a part of the Rensweed Science Lab, and we do a lot of this research and we put together a lot of materials for this kind of stuff. And on our website, we actually have a bunch of these fact sheets for a lot of these invasives. And so if you just go to Google and you type in Rensweed Science, it'll usually bring you straight to this homepage. And then you can see the resources tab has an invasive plant management option for the fact sheets. And so you can click on that. And what it'll do is bring you to this page, which gives you everything that we have fact sheets for. And you can click on them for individuals. And this is for honeysuckle. And it'll give you what the technique is, the herbicide that we're suggesting or giving comments on, how effective it is, and then just some other additional information for applying that as well. And so I actually wanted to go through a few individual examples of this for people, because I know a lot of times people would like to have kind of actual specific examples for these kind of things or have questions about specific examples. And so just kind of running through one of these with people. Right away, we give some information on identification for leaves, flowers, and some growth, and then some ecological threats. And then we've got our control options for things. So for bush honeysuckle, we've got these non-chemical options as well. And then we've also got a lot of herbicide options. And so for bush honeysuckle, when it comes to foliar options, glyphosate or Roundup as a foliar option gives us a 90 to 100% control the year after application, so that following year we're still seeing a 90 to 100% control on those individuals. And so for a rate, and you'll have to look for conversions and figure out based on what you're going to be spraying and the amounts, how much you need. I wish I could give some examples, but everything is different on, say, the acid amount or the amount of that herbicide in the product. And so that's going to ultimately dictate just how much you'll be needing. And foliar is a lot more minute with that stuff since you're using a lot less, that those small amounts kind of matter more. And so for this one, for a broadcast option, anywhere from 1.7 to a 3.7 pounds of acid equivalent per acre. And so on a whole acre of land, we're saying you should be able to put down 1.7 to 3.7 pounds of that active ingredient in the glyphosate. And so you'll have to figure that out for if you're going to use a broadcast option, what your best one is. For spot treatment, we say anywhere from a 1 to 4%. And so this is kind of getting on a more volume basis. So in, say, a quart, we're saying 1 to 4% of that quart should be the glyphosate product. So we do have some specific recommendations, but a lot of them for the foliar are going to be more like that. Some other foliar options, Arsenal, we had pretty decent control, but Arsenal's a non-selective. So if you have desirables, maybe something more like a triclopyr would be a better option for this. Some options for cut stump, imazapyr, stalker is the common name, gave great control. But usually the one that's recommended the most when it comes to at least woodies is going to be your triclopyrs, your Garlon. That's the most common one is going to be Garlon. And usually what we're going to be doing is for a cut surface, it's going to be a 20 to 30% solution in oil. And that's pretty common and similar to the basal bark as well. And so a great one for this is you can actually mix, say, a 20% solution and go target honeysuckle, and you can do both your cut surface and your basal bark at the same time. You don't need to mix a new solution. You can have that 20% and use it on everything and get the same effectiveness. So that's a nice option, at least for honeysuckle in this one.
It's interesting you mentioned honeysuckle. There was a question about that someone this I feel sorry for this person. They had multiple different invasive plants on their 3-acre property that they're trying to control.
Sure.
And that's a tough situation to begin with, and they're
Yeah.
struggling with the triclopyr not being effective on some versus others, and
Mm-hmm.
um, give this person hope.
There is hope. You just have to, you got to stick with it and stick at it. One thing that when I worked for the Wisconsin DNR, what we did was we would usually have our woody mix would be a 20% Garlon 4. And then we'd actually add a half to 1% milestone kicker as well. And what that did was it just kind of gave that mix a little bit more where those harder to really control things, say like honeysuckle or the basswoods and stuff like that. It seemed to give that mix that push that it needed to get that control on things. So yeah, especially if you've got 3 different things that are pretty broadly different where you just can't do the same approach, it really makes it tough. If you have to kind of choose one to really target and really get a good control and see some success on that, that might be a good option just so you don't feel like you're in a continuous losing battle. Take your wins when you can, even if it's small, because those little things could grow into the big successes as well. So I do have a bunch of other options here. We'll go say to glossy buckthorn and common buckthorn. That's a really common one that people deal with as well. And for this one, we actually have some pre-emergence options. I haven't personally done a whole lot with that as an option for people, but we do have some research and some recommendations for it. But for foliar, like we were seeing with glyphosate, with glyphosate on honeysuckle, we were seeing really great season after control. We weren't seeing it with the buckthorn. And so in this case, glyphosate probably wouldn't be a good recommendation for buckthorn when it comes to foliar option, where triclopyr seems to have a lot better control when we're using this as a foliar option compared to the glyphosate. And this is, it's similar with the cut stump as well. So we're just not seeing that glyphosate have an overall as much of an impact to the buckthorn as the triclopyr is. And so cut stump again for buckthorn, it's going to be at the 20 to 30. And so this is kind of where this person, if they're dealing with honeysuckle and buckthorn, they might be able to get 2 birds with 1 stone if they're using Garlon, say at 20 to 30%. and target all of those. It's it's tough to tell that there's one right answer for everything because everybody's got their own issues, their own troubles, their own things that they're dealing with. And so you really need to figure out what your plan is going to be, not just that season, but for the future and what your next step after you get this step done is. What's the next plan after you accomplish this to make sure that you keep seeing that success and keep pushing what you're trying to accomplish along. So,
Hey, Travis, are you
yeah.
sharing new things or we're still seeing the herbicide recommendation slide? Have you been sharing other things as well?
Oh, geez. Hold on.
I'm sorry I didn't jump in earlier.
Do you see that now?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
man. Okay. So this is what I have been talking about, and I apologize. I thought this was sharing. So these are our online fact sheets, and these are what's giving a lot of these recommendations for what we would say to use. Herbicide, the herbicide, the chemical name, and then also some common names. And so for buckthorn here, we've got glyphosate, which is we use Roundup. And what we're seeing is in season, we're getting a 50 to 70% control, but the season after, we're only getting around 50 or below. Where for triclopyr, we're getting that 90 to 100% for the in season and that following season. So in this instance, triclopyr would probably be the better option for buckthorn. And then it's also showing great effectiveness with the cut stump, which, like I had mentioned, we're using that 20 to 30% Garlon, which was just as effective on the honeysuckle. And so you can kind of use this as a two-edged sword to be able to get more things than done, target more than just one individual at a time.
Could you zoom in a little bit?
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, perfect.
And so, yeah, we give a few options, even the things that we don't get great results on. We want to show and tell people, like I was saying, glyphosate foliar option on buckthorn. We're not getting great results with it, and we want to tell people that so they can make that decision. Maybe glyphosate works on everything else for them, but if it's not going to work on buckthorn, maybe it's not worth trying it on buckthorn. And maybe it's worth using the triclopyr that we're seeing steady control with kind of about every time that we're using it. So, and then what I want to do is bring this up. And this is actually where I pulled that from. This is our database, our fact sheet database, where it's got kind of all of our species. You've got scientific names and then our common names. This is going to be all plant, not all of them, but all of the ones that we have recommendations and information and stuff on. So this will be honeysuckles, which are your restricted species a lot of times. And then also say black swallowwort, or we have a little bit on Japanese stiltgrass, which we don't have a ton of information on, but we have some other research done that we've been able to pull, say, recommendations from Illinois, where they deal with this tremendously, or Indiana and other issues. And so this is a great tool for people who are looking maybe for some recommendations and aren't really sure where to start. This gives some options for that. A lot of these are going to be fairly commonly used herbicides, say in restoration work and conservation and stuff like that. There will be some unique ones, but typically we're going to have your most common ones that you see. And so for herbicide recommendations, I would definitely suggest looking at these sheets. We've got a lot of time invested in these to make sure that we're giving the correct recommendations for people. And then, yeah, at the top, I had mentioned it's got just some basic information on that individual species, some phenology, some growing ID things, and then some ecological threats as well. So I can keep going through some of these species examples. But Bill, if there was any specifically that we wanted to look at, I could do that too.
There was a question about black locust.
Okay. Yep. What was the question? Sorry.
Uh, uh, in fact, the person who had the multiple species mentioned they have black
Sure.
locust, and then it's someone else mentioned that they were getting resprouting,
Yeah.
root sprouting. Yeah. So
So black locust, as I'm sure a lot of people know, it's a tough one. Because you get that suckering and that resprouting. Our recommendation, I guess, if I had to say it as a lab whole, would be unless you know um, that you're going to be able to get every single individual, it's probably a better option to stick away from anything that damages that individual. So cut surface is probably not a good option. Um, but that's tough when you have large individuals because there's no way to treat those without damaging it somehow. Um, if if you can get to it early enough and spray the small ones with the foliar, that seems to have some good control. Another option is kind of find your infestation. And this doesn't necessarily go towards how to spray it, but just kind of the plan of attack is kind of starting out and maybe move your way closer to the higher infested areas. Start outside with your, we'll call them the scout plants, where they're kind of moving and expanding their zone. Cut those off and push that population back to where you can get it in an area that's more manageable. Because if you start in the middle and you wreak havoc there, all of those suckers on the outside are just going to thrive, and you're actually going to spurn them a little bit to where they're going to actually make your life worse. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of great suggestions for black locust because it's kind of like aspen. It's tough with that suckering aspect. So,
I got a couple questions about tree of heaven.
sure,
Um, uh, it's a restricted species, right? Is it a restricted species?
I can look real quick. I would imagine it's prohibited.
Okay. And if there's any recommendations for treatment, herbicide to use on that?
Yeah. I so I don't personally have any experience with it, but like I said, we've got these sheets. And so any sort of recommendation our lab would give is probably going to be coming from these sheets. And so it's a new one. We haven't done a whole lot with it in the lab because it's just not super prevalent. We've got it in Dane County, but it hasn't really escaped, so to speak, um, that we're worried. Yeah,
Okay. No, if you, that's all right. Well, the sheet is might be the best resource. We'll point
I
them to
think
that.
so. Yeah,
Okay.
or direct communication maybe, and we can figure out a better plan. I just don't have a lot of great tree of heaven information off the top of my head. It's not one that I've done a ton with. Actually, Matt Walrath, who is our Wifton coordinator, he actually has more experience having to deal with spotted lanternfly and stuff like that.
And I'll be sharing the link to the fact sheets page with the recording tomorrow.
Good. Okay.
So there's some questions about some of our aggressive native plants
Sure.
and controlling them, especially if they're starting to crowd like oak seedlings coming up, and you might get some prickly ash was mentioned specifically,
Sure.
but there's some of our native plants that are really aggressive and can grow really thick and be a problem. What's your suggestions for treating those or controlling those? Is it herbicide? Is there better options?
Um, I want to touch real quick. Whoever mentioned the restricted thing on tree heaven is correct. It is a restricted species according to the NR40. So not prohibited. That's my mistake.
Okay.
When it comes to using natives or dealing with aggressive and natives, hmm, I personally would try to build competition through other natives. A lot of times what I've seen, prickly ash is tough. A burn can do a lot of damage to prickly ash. It seems to um, be pretty weak overall compared to a lot of other woody stuff. And so running a burn through actually sets them back pretty good. Um, but I have actually treated prickly ash before. And that's we were using that same mix of the 20% Garlon with that milestone kicker and had almost 100% success, probably just the ones we missed. So prickly ash is tough. Raspberry is another tough one that people have to deal with. And a lot of times what people deal with is using, say, fire as a management option, but what you get in turn is a flush of these native non-desirables. You could, if you want to avoid herbicide, you could just cut them back. And like I said, keep trying to instill that competition through those desirable species, whether that be interseeding or just trying to help promote them one way or another. I think the best thing you can do is to build resiliency into your land, um, and slowly start to wear away from that dependency on the human factor to allow it to kind of take care of itself. I know it's tough this day and age to allow them to kind of do their own thing, but the more and more you can allow that area to kind of take care of itself for the most part, um, the better it's going to be able to thrive and persist and just do better in the long run. So
You had mentioned using fire. Is there some of the invasive plants that are more susceptible to controlled burns than others?
garlic mustard seems to really get hit by fire. Um, and I think it's because it just that seed bank can get roasted pretty good. Um, One thing that a lot of people do for, say, those seedlings or the cotyledons of garlic mustard is they'll take those propane torches. I'm sure there's some people that have done this, and they'll just go out and they'll burn those cotyledons down. And it works really, really well. There's, like I had mentioned with those native the native species non-desirables. There are some invasives that are going to kind of take hold after fire, and that's primarily due to the disturbance it creates, not so much that it thrives with that fire. And so um, that again, it's kind of coupling that fire with something else. So coming back and interseeding or spraying those resprouts that come in and trying to fill in with your desirable species. But prickly ash seems to get hit pretty hard with fire. And personally, I don't know of any others that it really hits really, really hard. Um, but it seems like it impacts more natives positively in the long run than maybe it negatively impacts invasives. And so that I think that positive outgains the negative overall. And so that's why I would promote it.
There's a question about the forced mowing and the creation of the mulch.
Sure.
Is 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 there any or maybe do you know anything about maybe it being able to burn the mulch as a second step as another control measure, or it's not been studied or not effective? What's your thoughts?
I don't think it's been studied. The only thing I would say is I don't know how well that would carry fire across the landscape because that mulch it's more of, say, this is getting into fire terminology, more of, say, the 10 to whatever hour where it needs longer to get that heat to combust and burn, where that leaf matter that you see in those savannas is really those oak leaves with that waxy coating is really what promotes that fire across the landscape. I'm not saying that the mulch wouldn't burn. I have a hard time saying that you would get a really great burn unless you had maybe um, some really long drying periods or some drought conditions that really dried that fuel out. And then at that point, I think it would probably be a hazard because too, it would be too flammable, in my opinion. So um, I get what they're coming coming from that'd be an awesome, really great way to get rid of the mulch. Then one go, unfortunately, I don't know how feasible it would be. But I have no experience and I haven't heard of anybody else kind of taking that approach. So
That's about it for the questions. Do you want to go through a couple more examples?
yeah. Um, I mean, we can look at the tree of heaven together while we're here, unless there's some other. We'll do this quick, and then we can do some more specific examples. So, from our data sheet for the tree of heaven, foliar might be an option, but I feel like more often than not, when people find this plant, it's huge, and so foliar might not be your best choice. Um, but if you were to go that route, at least foliar wise, we don't really see that great of control, especially the season after. We're only getting about a 70%, and that's using glyphosate and imazapyr, which is a arsenal, which is non-selective. So it doesn't seem like that foliar option is a great one. When it comes to cut stump, we're getting looks like decent control with dicamba, but I probably wouldn't suggest that one. Um, Glyphosate seems to have some decent control. Um, Everything seems to have pretty good control that season after. The only thing that I worry about with the 70 to 90 is we're not seeing any 100s. And so that means things are still surviving. And if they survive, that means they'll potentially be able to reproduce and proliferate more. So if you were to do cut surface, um, I'd almost maybe suggest a non-selective just to get that extra oomph with it, maybe. Give it as much of that ability as it has. Um, and it looks like we do have the option, but hack and squirt, we're getting kind of the same effects with this as we were with the cut surface with the same herbicides as well. And it looks like possibly triclopyr with basil bark um, gives some good results. So depending on the size of your individual, you could maybe try the basil bark approach. Another option with bigger individuals is to, as long as it's not, say, black locust or a suckering tree, is to cut it and then apply it to those resprouts, say as a foliar or some option like that. But we weren't really getting great foliar control, so maybe doing a cut surface option would be your best approach, and then just kind of watch those resprouts and keep managing however you can with what you got. So
I did get a question come in about reed canary grass and maybe doing some planting within it of
mhm.
native shrubs and trees. What's your recommendation for working with reed canary grass infestation?
That's a tough one. Because I think they've got a great approach with putting those natives in. I have heard that cordgrass is supposed to be really good at kind of directly competing with reed canary grass. So if you can get your hands on that, definitely try throwing that in. Um, but it's tough. I don't know. I would try to do kind of like I was saying with the locust approach. I would try and beat it back from the outsides in and develop an edge as you go in more and more. I wouldn't go straight into the heart of it and kind of tackle that unless you're able to unless you're able to remove it. But even then, you risk leaving some root parts and some get some regrowth and having that issue. And so I would start from the outside and moving in. I'm guessing they've probably dealt with this, but with reed canary, you do have to worry. A lot of them are in swales and a lot of them are in wet swales. So just dealing with that issue too. And the other problem with that is that water is normally the main vector for why that was there in the first place. And so if that's the case, you kind of just have to build this into your plan that you're going to go out and you're going to do the Reed Canary swale this again in say June or July or whenever the time you're going to do it. You're going to say do your burn. You're going to come out and you're going to interseed as much as you can in that area. And then you're going to apply your herbicide shortly after the burn because that Reed Canary tends to be one of the first things to emerge after that burn. And so what that does is it allows you good um, targeted control of your individuals. And if you can do it early enough too, you also get away, at least not entirely, but potential for off-target damage with the natives coming in. If you can get it kind of, there is more or less a Goldilocks period kind of at the beginning of the year where you have these early succession things coming in or these early growing things coming in right away. Parsnip's a good example of that too, where you can target these early in the season with even glyphosate, a non-selective, and you can have good control before those natives come up. And so you get that all done and the natives get to come up and then they don't have that competition. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to say, start from the outside, move in and just kind of keep pushing that restriction back as much as you can.
I got a question about walnut
Okay,
and resprouts. What's
sure.
your, they tried triclopyr,
And it didn't work.
they got resprouts. Yeah, I'm sorry. They got, yeah, lots of resprouts.
Interesting. Um, I can't say I've had with a 20% Garlon, I've had usually pretty good control. Now, if that's what they were using, it might be worth it to add, say, that extra um, half ounce or half percent of the milestone to help just kind of give it the little extra bit. Yeah, that's not one that I've heard going out of like growing through the herbicide a lot. So um depending on how big those resprouts or those suckers are, I would say as long as they're not above your head, you could maybe go back in with a foliar option and do it that way if you want, or um, just keep targeting those resprouts and either cut or basal bark those those resprouts because eventually you're probably going to get to the point where it's going to run out of energy. And as long as you can keep attacking that, um, it should die off. I've never had to do it. So yeah, that's that. I don't have another herbicide recommendation for that either. You could maybe do it a non-selective, so maybe Arsenal or a glyphosate cut surface option could work possibly. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a question about what does it mean percent per gallon? Is it, could you kind of describe what that process is like trying to make that calculation and getting the mix right?
Yeah, so it's going to be a little different for your foliar. And like I said, I don't know if we'll be able to get into that. But at least for your cut surface and your basal bark and things like that, what I mean on the, like I've got on the sheet here where it's got a 20 to 30% in oil, that is just your volume. You've got a 20 to 30% volume of your herbicide um, in your overall amount. So if you've got a gallon that you're mixing up, 20 to 30% of that overall amount is going to be your herbicide. So I don't even, I wish I had numbers. I should have probably got some
That's
specifics.
okay. I'm
I wish
trying
I
to
knew
think off the top of my head. I'm trying to put that together too.
an
It's
easy one. Say you got
no.
100, so yeah, 100 mil, say you want to mix up 100 milliliters or 100 liters. 20 to 30 liters of that mix is going to be your herbicide. And
Hmm.
then the rest of that is going to be your oil or water if you're using glyphosate. And so that's where that 20 or that percentage that we have on these sheets comes from. It's going to be a per volume basis. So 5%, you're going to do your your 50 liters in your, or whatever it is. You're going to take your 5% of that overall volume, and that's the amount of herbicide that you put in there.
And you talked about adding a kicker. So if it's maybe one per, I don't remember what number you said it was 1%. That's coming
Yep.
from the not the herbicide. You're not subtracting from the like triclopyr. You're
Nope.
you're subtracting from the oil or water.
Oil. Yeah. So if you were to do that, the 20%, let's say 100 liters, and I said it wrong, I think earlier, you're going to put your 20%, your 20 liters of the triclopyr in there, and then you're also going to have that 1 liter of milestone, and so that'll be 21 total liters of herbicide, and that should leave you with 79 liters of your which you're mixing it in the oil or water.
Okay.
And so that kicker, you don't substitute the other herbicide, you add that on top of it.
Okay.
Yep.
We just got a few minutes left. If
Yeah.
there's any great words of wisdom you want to send folks off with when they're using herbicides?
I think I did actually have a little bit more on my
Sure. Yeah,
presentation,
go ahead.
and it's just kind of the end of the day thing to remember with these invasives, um, is to make sure we're checking our equipment, whether that's big machinery, your boots, anything you're using. We're going into infested areas and we don't want to track it out and produce new populations. So make sure you're cleaning before if you can, but especially after you go into an infested area. For equipment, you definitely want to go through if you can. Spray and clean things in an area that you know is approved for that. You don't want to go to somewhere that's a community wash bay or something and spray a bunch of stiltgrass seeds into the bay and they somehow make their way out and now we've got a stiltgrass population producing somewhere else. Um, Another one is know the dirt that you're possibly using to fill in areas where you're getting it from, what's been there before, if there's been any issues with that. Um, and then kind of like I've touched on before, a lot of these invasives and just even non-desirables, your annuals are especially, they love disturbance. So if you come in and you make a bunch of disturbance, they're going to be the first things that try to take hold. And so getting those natives in there and those desirables and getting those built in to help combat that succession will just help you in the long run, not deal with these things maybe down the road. And so minimizing that window helps as well. And then I also wanted to kind of plug the First Detector Network again. Matt does a lot of great stuff with monitoring these species and trying to make sure that we don't have big issues and keeping all the data on these populations and how things are changing. So I've got this for our online resources as well. There's a bunch of great stuff on here with all sorts of information if you need that. And then we're kind of already there, but any other remaining questions? I do have, I can actually click on it here quick. If anybody's interested, these are actually the trials that I put together and that I do throughout the year. And what that link does is sends you to that page where it gives you all of my my reports that I put together on all the trials that I've done through the year. And it just kind of gives a brief overview. So if anybody wants more specific, more detail on wild parsnip control using site view specific, we have that information as well. So feel free to look at that. It's open to all of you to gather that information and use as you see fit. So, but with that, that's all I've got, unless there's any other last minute things or
Nope.
species specific things. No?
No, I think we're all set. Thanks, Travis. Great job.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for participating. And on Thursday, we'll be talking about managing your woods for your own benefit. Uh, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks again, Travis.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. We'll talk to you later.